By the spring of 1944, the pressure on Eisenhower was unlike anything he had faced before. He was not just planning a military operation. He was orchestrating the largest amphibious assault in human history. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, and the hopes of an entire continent depended on getting it right. Every decision carried weight. Every leak could be catastrophic. And for Eisenhower, one of the most critical and controversial decisions was to keep the true landing location of DDay a secret. Not just from the enemy, but from his own generals. It was a gamble unlike any other, a high-wire act of trust, secrecy, and calculated risk. The stakes were staggering. If the Germans discovered where the Allies would strike, the massive invasion force could be met with prepared defenses, devastating artillery, and nearly insurmountable resistance. The lives of thousands, possibly tens of thousands, hung in the balance. And yet, Eisenhower also knew that information is like a double-edged sword. The more people who know, the greater the risk of leaks, accidental slips, or even subtle miscommunication that could alert the enemy. To maintain the element of surprise, he made the radical decision to limit knowledge, sharing only what was absolutely necessary with each commander. Even his most trusted generals were kept partially in the dark. The secrecy was not a casual choice. It was a calculated strategy. Eisenhower worked closely with intelligence officers and planners to create a web of deception that would protect the real landing site while misleading both German spies and Allied officers who were not directly involved. Fake troop movements, decoy equipment, and false plans all reinforced the illusion that the attack would hit somewhere other than Normandy. In essence, secrecy became a weapon, one wielded with the same precision as tanks or artillery. Every withheld piece of information was a layer of defense, a buffer against disaster. This decision naturally caused tension within the Allied command. Generals, used to having access to operational details, had to trust Eisenhower's judgment even when they couldn't see the full picture. Some questioned whether withholding such critical information was too risky, whether commanders might hesitate or make mistakes if they didn't fully understand the plan. But Eisenhower believed that absolute secrecy, combined with precise instructions, would ultimately save lives and ensure the success of the operation. It was a delicate balance. Enough information for commanders to prepare, but not enough to compromise the landing. By the time June 6 arrived, Eisenhower's gamble had paid off. The Germans, expecting an attack elsewhere, were caught off guard. The Allies struck with precision, taking advantage of months of meticulous planning and disciplined secrecy, keeping the landing location hidden until the last possible moment had given the invasion the critical element of surprise it needed to succeed. Eisenhower's choice to withhold the details from even his own generals was more than a controversial decision. It was a defining moment of leadership, one that demonstrated the high stakes of command, the burden of responsibility, and the razor-edge judgment required to turn strategy into victory. The lesson is clear. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't firepower or manpower, but control of information, timing, and trust. Eisenhower understood that in war, what your enemy doesn't know can be just as deadly as what they fear. And keeping the D-Day landing location secret was the gamble that changed history. Once Eisenhower decided to keep the landing site a secret, the challenge shifted to managing the delicate dance of misinformation. It wasn't enough to simply withhold information from his own generals. He also had to make sure the Germans believed the invasion would happen somewhere else entirely. Every message, every troop movement, and every signal had to serve two purposes: prepare the Allies for a successful attack while convincing the enemy they were heading into the wrong place. It was a war of shadows, a psychological battle waged with deception as the primary weapon. And Eisenhower was at the center of it all, orchestrating a carefully balanced web of truth and lies. The Allies went to extraordinary lengths to mislead the Germans. Fake radio traffic mimicked entire units and locations where no one actually existed. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and wooden artillery were positioned to create the illusion of massive preparations in areas far from Normandy. Reconnaissance planes spotted these decoys, transmitting the evidence directly into German intelligence. It was a masterclass in misdirection. By carefully controlling what the enemy could see, Eisenhower ensured that the Germans would focus their defenses in the wrong places, leaving the actual invasion beaches less fortified and more vulnerable. At the same time, Eisenhower had to maintain a careful balance with his own generals. These were men used to absolute clarity, Men who commanded thousands of troops and hundreds of vehicles. They needed enough information to coordinate logistics, timing, and strategy. But not so much that the secret of the landing site could leak through conversation, accident, or misjudgment. Eisenhower's leadership was tested daily. He had to inspire trust, manage doubts, and make sure that every officer under his command was confident in executing their orders even while being deliberately kept in the dark. It was a unique exercise in both psychology and authority, requiring a deep understanding of human behavior and the ability to anticipate how stress and uncertainty would influence decision-making. The misinformation campaign wasn't limited to physical deception. It extended to the psychological realm. Eisenhower and his team played on the enemy's expectations, exploiting assumptions about timing, terrain, and strategy. By planting subtle hints in communications and using double agents to feed the Germans selective information, the Allies created a narrative that reinforced the false target at Pas de Calais. Every intercepted message, every supposed troop movement, every simulated build-up contributed to a picture that was convincing enough to delay German reinforcements from Normandy and leave the real invasion unopposed during its critical first hours. This intelligence game required constant vigilance. Any misstep, an overlooked detail, a miscommunicated order, a careless comment, could unravel months of preparation. Eisenhower's genius lay in understanding that secrecy wasn't just about what you hide. It's also about what you show and how you control perception. By managing both his own forces and the enemy's expectations, he created a scenario where the success of D-Day depended not just on firepower or manpower, but on manipulation, foresight, and the precise orchestration of information. In the end, the combination of misinformation, controlled trust, and psychological insight ensured that when the invasion began, the Germans were caught off guard. Eisenhower's ability to balance secrecy with operational readiness turned the Allied deception into one of the most effective strategies of the war, proving that in modern warfare, sometimes what the enemy believes is just as important as what they see. When it came to keeping the D-Day landing site a secret, Eisenhower was walking a razor's edge between risk and reward. The risk was enormous. Withholding critical information from his own generals could have led to confusion, miscalculated movements, or hesitation at the very moment when decisive action was required. Imagine thousands of soldiers poised to storm the beaches, thousands of vehicles lined up, and commanders unsure of exactly where the first wave would hit. One wrong assumption, one misinterpreted order, and the consequences could have been catastrophic. Yet Eisenhower trusted his planning, his intelligence teams, and, above all, his judgment. He understood that revealing the full picture to everyone wasn't just unnecessary. It could actually compromise the success of the operation. The gamble of secrecy relied on absolute discipline. Each general received only the information they needed to carry out their specific mission. They knew enough to prepare their troops, to understand timing and logistics, but not enough to guess the actual location of the landing. This required them to trust not just their superiors but the very structure of the operation. They had to follow orders without knowing the full story, relying on Eisenhower's strategic vision rather than their own assumptions. In the chaos of war, that kind of blind trust is almost impossible. Yet it was exactly what the success of D-Day demanded. Meanwhile, Eisenhower had to manage the psychological pressure of holding such a dangerous secret. He was aware that any slip, even a casual comment in a meeting, could potentially reach German intelligence. Every conversation with his officers was carefully measured. Every briefing meticulously planned to provide clarity without compromising the secret. The burden of this responsibility weighed heavily, because the lives of thousands of soldiers and the fate of the war hinged on it. Yet despite the pressure, Eisenhower remained calm, focused, and decisive. A steady hand guiding the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. The payoff for this calculated secrecy was immediate and decisive. When the invasion finally began on June 6, 1944, the Germans were caught off guard. Their defenses were concentrated in areas where the Allies weren't planning to strike, leaving the Normandy beaches comparatively under-defended. This element of surprise allowed the first wave of troops to gain a foothold, turning what could have been a bloody disaster into the beginning of a turning point for the Allied forces. Eisenhower's gamble, the decision to trust in secrecy over complete transparency, had created a situation where careful planning and disciplined execution outweighed brute force alone. In retrospect, The decision to keep his own generals partially in the dark was one of Eisenhower's most daring acts of leadership. It wasn't reckless. It was a calculated risk designed to protect lives and secure victory. By managing both the flow of information and the perceptions of his commanders and the enemy, he ensured that the operation unfolded with precision, surprise, and maximum effectiveness. The success of D-Day proved that sometimes in war, the greatest weapon isn't tanks or artillery. It's timing, strategy, and control of information. Eisenhower's courage to hold back the full truth demonstrated that leadership often means making choices that others might not understand, but that history will ultimately vindicate.